name is Charles Whitmore and I coordinate the Wales Civil Society Forum on Brexit, so the title of our project is up there. It is a partnership between the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University and WCVA to provide information on the law and policy of Brexit to third sector organisations in Wales, to try and help them have a voice and to try and keep up with developments in the process. So, there we go. I'm going to split my contribution into two sections today. In the first instance, for everyone who doesn't have the pleasure of working full-time on Brexit like I do, I'm going to get us caught up to speed. And then I'm going to speak more specifically about Brexit and implications for third sector organisations, and specifically for disabled people and their representative organisations. So, obviously, as Rian mentioned, we held an event last summer, and the context is quite different. Now we're quite a bit further on in the process. I wish I had all the answers, but I'm sorry, as we'll probably find out throughout the day, that there are still many questions. But in terms of what's different, the UK has now withdrawn from the EU, and the first myth I would like to bust is that despite the rhetoric around that was very prevalent in the general election about get Brexit, let's get Brexit done, and that Brexit has been achieved, as you might see occasionally written or spoken, that is not the case. There is still much work to do, and it will indeed take years for both UK government, the Welsh government, third sector organisations generally, to adapt to what will be a very different operating landscape. You may have noticed as well that Brexit features much less heavily in the media now than it did a year ago. Obviously that's partially because we've got other things going on, but it also fits into a broader narrative of UK government not necessarily wanting to even use the term Brexit anymore. So, we have now entered a 3-year transition period, which will be used largely to negotiate what we're calling the future relationship with the EU. Now, this is essentially a trade agreement, but it comes on the back of what we're calling the Withdrawal Agreement. So there was a bit of confusion during the whole Brexit process around what was our agreement with the EU. There will in fact be two of them. We have achieved the first one, which is the Withdrawal Agreement, and it covered things like citizens' rights, the financial settlement with the EU, what you may see occasionally referred to as the Brexit Bill, the border on the island of Ireland, and has indeed established this transition period that will last until the 31st of December. And we're using this period to negotiate the future relationship with the EU. So, in terms of what's changed and what hasn't changed, now that the UK has left the EU, our representation in the institutions of the EU has ended. So we no longer have MEPs, and UK government officials are no longer attending meetings in Brussels. However, free movement continues during the transition period, both if you want to go on holiday, or if you want to move to the EU and work, or if EU citizens indeed want to come to the UK on holiday or work here. EU funding is continuing for now. That's mainly for programs that have received funding already. Those programs will continue until their end. You can technically still apply for EU funding during the transition period, but that's difficult for a couple of different reasons. And trade between the UK and the EU will remain the same for much of this year. So all of that remains the same on that front, and this period will be used to negotiate the future relationship. So, in addition to negotiating the future relationship, we're going to be using this year, what is essentially 10 months now, to negotiate trade agreements with other countries, and I think these are all things that disabled people's organisations will want to be keeping an eye on. We will need to find a replacement for EU funding. Now, UK government have said that this will be called the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and I'll say a little bit more about that on a further slide. We also need to work on securing the rights of EU citizens who are already living in the UK. So all EU citizens living here will need to apply to what is called the European Settlement Scheme. And we have a panel on that later with an expert coming from a solicitor's firm in Cardiff who are providing complex case referrals and help with applying to that to talk to us about the specifics. And we have, is that cutting off at the bottom? Sorry about that. So, and we will need to pass a raft of Brexit legislation around things like trade, immigration, agriculture, and fisheries. So, after the transition period, so from the 1st of January 2021 onwards, what will change is that we will start to see borders and customs checks. Free movement will end. We'll need new immigration controls in place, and UK government have actually put forward proposals now as to what those what that immigration system will look like. We're calling it the Post-Brexit immigration system, and there are a variety of concerns around it, and I think civil society plays a very important role in informing that process. In Wales, we've been quite vocal, for instance, around the income threshold that was suggested. So under this new system, EU citizens will have to use the same system to emigrate to the UK as any other country, and it was suggested that a £30,000 per year income threshold would be necessary to accept to give visas to come, but that has since been lowered to, I think, about 26,500, which is progress, but we think it might still be a bit too high. And I suppose my key message for the day, but particularly through this transition period, will be for organisations to be vigilant on several fronts, and in particular because this is a very, very tight timescale. Free trade agreements of this nature, and indeed we're looking for something broader than a free trade agreement, really. We're looking for a relationship with the EU on a number of different fronts, and many implications of which are important to disabled people, but go well beyond trade, and I'll talk a bit about those in a moment. But I'm sorry to say that many of the details that we're hoping to emerge will probably only emerge very, very late on in this process. The UK kind of needs to decide whether or not it wants to extend the transition period by this summer. We don't think they're not likely to want to, because they've written it into legislation that can't happen, although there are ways around that if the UK government really wants to extend. But 10 months is an awfully tight timeline, and to negotiate and implement the agreement, it seems almost impossible. So we may well see details emerge after this deadline expires. Okay. One of the biggest consequences of this timeline is that it means that a no-deal Brexit remains, metaphorically speaking, on the table. So you would have heard a lot about this last year. UK and Welsh government were putting a lot of money and effort into preparing the country for leaving the EU without the withdrawal agreement I mentioned earlier. And that remains a possibility at the end of this year. It would look slightly different than the one we were scared of last year, because we have the withdrawal agreement in place. So certain aspects are secured. For instance, citizens' rights have been guaranteed in that agreement. So we had a question last Tuesday about pension rights. Some of those rights are secured in the withdrawal agreement. So even if we didn't secure a trading relationship with the EU after Brexit, some of those rights are guaranteed. And the situation on Northern Ireland has essentially a backstop, a solution now if we leave without a trade agreement, and the UK has already agreed the bill essentially that it will pay the EU. So that's a very, very brief catch-up in terms of where we are now in the Brexit process. We have a very packed timeline for the next year, and there are still a lot of uncertainties. And for civil society's role in this process, well, much of civil society, as is the case for Disability Wales and indeed for our project, we are Brexit neutral. And our efforts have focused largely on providing information, transparency and scrutiny in the Brexit process to ensure that the process is empirically informed and respects the rights of our stakeholders. We've also been working to try and mitigate the negative impact, or any negative impact, of Brexit, and particularly for communities and interest groups. this was largely the work we did around no deal Brexit and trying to help organisations prepare for that and ensure that the government, UK and Welsh, were informed of the concerns that organisations had. And perhaps our biggest strand of work has been around exploring the human, social and environmental rights impact of Brexit. So, as I'm sure some people in the room will be aware, disabled people have derived a lot of rights from EU legal frameworks. And so one of our key strands in this work is ensuring that we retain those rights despite Brexit. So, there is reason to be concerned on these fronts from the get-go, in my opinion. We saw in the passage of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which implemented the Withdrawal Agreement that was negotiated at the end of last year, we saw amendments rejected supporting workers' rights, supporting Erasmus, and even supporting the rights of child refugees. We know UK government has been concerned or has had the Human Rights Act and membership of the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights under consideration for quite some time. And our concerns that they may be looking at leaving the Council of Europe after Brexit is fully finished, I think is a very real one. They've also been trying to avoid scrutiny where possible. There was a chance, there were amendments suggested to ensure that Parliament had a role in negotiating the future relationship with the EU, so we could connect with our MPs and ensure that our voices were heard, but that role has been removed since the general election, so we have concerns around that. We've also already seen some losses in the field of human rights. So there was the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which should really have been a part of the body of EU-retained law that the UK has retained from the EU, but that particular piece of legislation was excluded. And civil society and legal experts feel that this will have a negative impact on our human rights. This next point isn't reflected in my PowerPoint because in typical Brexit fashion, I haven't had the time to update it since big developments have occurred. But we now have seen the UK government's negotiating mandate. And it's interesting to contrast the UK's position with the EU's position on the human rights front, because the EU's position has said quite clearly that they want the UK to remain members of the European Convention on Human Rights and have put quite a strong red line in that in terms of cancelling any cooperation around security issues if the UK withdraws from the European Convention. And when you look at the UK's opening stance, it's very much, no, actually we want complete control of our own human rights frameworks, and you can see quite clearly in it that includes they want the decision of whether to remain a member of the European Convention of Human Rights to rest squarely within the UK's hands. So they will push back on that European stance. And this is worrying because the EU has acted as essentially a human rights and constitutional safety net for the UK. The UK has a rather unique constitutional structure, and due to parliamentary sovereignty, essentially anything that Parliament does, it can undo. That's quite unique because in many European countries and in the EU itself, there are foundational treaties and constitutional texts which are very, very difficult to change. And the EU has brought that minimum level to the UK so the UK government can't override minimum standards and rights that are guaranteed by the EU. So as a result of Brexit, many policy fields will be open to change that could not previously be changed. So I think this should be of particular concern to disabled people's organisations and disabled people more generally for a variety of reasons. The EU has improved rights of disabled people through funding and mainstreaming rights, through providing knowledge share and best practice platforms, directly through legislation, and also through case law. And I'll just go through these very quickly to get everyone up to speed. So the European Social Fund, the European Regional Development Fund, as well as Horizon funding have all benefited disabled people in Wales, and Wales is indeed the biggest net beneficiary of EU funding in the UK, and one of the biggest in the EU, actually. And this has occurred through, I can see exasperated looks in the audience, and Yep, that's what, this has provided socially inclusive employment projects, as well as facilitated research around adaptive technologies and a variety of other things. It's also interesting that the EU mainstreams disability across policy areas. So whenever the EU legislates, it has to consider the impact and ramifications for disabled people, which has proven to be quite the stark contrast, I would say, to how Brexit has been carried out in the UK to date. Erasmus Plus is another example by supporting the mobility of disabled students. Oh, why did I do that? Sorry, I'm having trouble with the IT. The EU provides several platforms as well for disabled people's organisations like Disability Wales to share knowledge and experience at the European level. And the UK has actually in the past been quite active in some of these, like the European Association of Service Providers, for instance. And the European Disability Forum plays a particularly important role in ensuring that disabled people's organisations at the EU level are always consulted and always have a voice in the legislating process. So one of the things we're quite keen to come out on the other side of Brexit is to ensure that organisations in the UK are still connected into these platforms. We've met with some of them, and it's quite humbling to see how many of them are very much still open to UK membership or even membership from organisations in Wales. We spoke to some who told us that they had amended their terms of reference to say that they accept organisations, members of member states, but now also ex-EU member states, which is obviously a very clear nod to accommodate UK membership in these platforms. And again, on the train over, I was having a glance at the negotiating mandates, and it's written quite clearly in the EU's stance that the future relationship must include civil society dialogue between the UK and the EU. It's a bit sad that the UK's negotiating stance doesn't contain a counterpart provision to that, which is why I think organisations like Disability Wales and others have a very important role in pushing UK government and Welsh government to give a voice to civil society organisations throughout this process and beyond. In terms of legislation, there are a number of examples we could give. The Equality Framework Directive went farther than UK legislation by providing indirect discrimination and removing an exemption in discrimination suits for small companies. The Bus Directive is an example of production standards which require vehicles to be produced accessibly, in that instance for wheelchair accessibility. There are a variety of passenger rights and anti-discrimination measures in transport. If you want to travel on flights and ferries, you can ask for assistance, and this is a requirement that comes from the EU. And there's also been improvements in accessibility in terms of medicine packaging and public sector websites. We have acquired all of these from EU legislation, but there's not really a concern that these will disappear as a result of Brexit. In fact, they've been retained in UK legislation already. I suppose the bigger concern is what will happen to them further down the line, and also, will we keep up with new innovations that the EU is exploring at the moment? And I think there are a couple of really interesting ones that we might want to be pushing UK government on. For instance, the EU Accessibility Act is exploring accessibility improvements for things like public sector websites, ATMs, computers, operating systems, audiovisual equipment. It's quite an extensive list. And they're also trialling a system called the EU Disability Card. There's only about 8 European countries that are involved in the trial at the moment. Some relatively small ones. I think Italy might be the biggest one. And essentially this is a card that you can apply for in your home country that states that you are disabled under that country's legal framework. And you can then take that card to any other European country, and that country can't contest that you are disabled if you're trying to access services that are in that country for disabled people. It's a form of mutual recognition, essentially. It means that you don't have to be reassessed in the country you want to move to or the country you're visiting to access services for disabled people. Obviously, both of these that I've marked as upcoming, the UK will now miss out on, unfortunately. But as everything Brexit, there are opportunities. The UK government could legislate or try and secure agreements similar to these. It depends on political intention, and I'm sorry to say that I don't have much faith in the current government in that regard. The EU Court of Justice as well, the EU's judicial system, has played a very important role in bolstering disabled rights in the UK. Sometimes this has occurred even in the context where UK law has had a gap or been deficient in this area. So there was a 2008 Coleman case, for instance, which introduced discrimination by association, which UK legislation did not, and a compensation cap of £8,500 has been removed. I'm particularly keen to point these out as well because sometimes it's very easy to forget because the EU courts operate at such a high level. But as recently as 2017 and 2018, the court has had to intervene to ensure that what would have been discriminatory UK legislation, very recent legislation, actually treats people equally. So these were cases involving LGBT people and accessing your pension, so there wasn't pension equality in the UK. Rian touched on this as well a little bit. It's interesting that the UNCRPD has a greater status in law at the European level than it does at the UK level. So the UNCRPD is an international treaty. In EU law, it sits just below the treaties, the foundational treaties. It's essentially higher than ordinary, regular, primary legislation at the European level. And as a result, courts have to strike down legislation at the European level that doesn't conform to it. That's a very striking difference to how it's treated in the UK, because the UK would need to use implementing legislation to ensure that it is enforceable in the UK, but it has not done that. And as Rian mentioned, in Wales, we're very keen that the UNCRPD be incorporated at the domestic level to bolster that enforceability. And we think that that's particularly important in light of Brexit, because we are losing a great deal of our rights and their own enforceability. So I'm almost finished now. I'm just going to pull out a couple of very specific points that have emerged from our previous engagements and workshops. The first one is around medicines. So everyone here was probably paying attention to the concern in the media around the interruptions of supplies to medication, particularly when it looked like we were leaving the EU without an agreement. The UK government's stance on this was quite clear, that there was no risk of disruptions, that they had made they could put in place adequate contingency plans. The Welsh government was very much of the same opinion. We'd kind of expect the governments to take that stance, I think, and it's interesting to note that there were experts that were quite convinced that these plans were not sufficient to fully mitigate these risks if we left without an agreement. And I'll come back to what I was saying earlier, in that if it looks like we're leaving the EU without a trade agreement at the end of this year, we might well see these concerns re-emerge. I suppose perhaps the bigger risk here, though, is that, and I think we've started to see this to some extent already, is that the cost of medication may rise for the NHS. We're also worried that the UK might not be seen as a priority market for new cutting-edge medicines moving forward, because we offer, quite simply, a smaller market now than the EU does. We also had questions around blue badges and European health insurance cards. Now, I can't answer these questions fully yet, because some of this will depend on what our relationship looks like with the EU after the transition period, but we do know that they'll still be valid during the transition period. Blue badges, technically, there shouldn't be a problem in using these after the transition period. They're not tied to membership of the European Union. They're a reciprocal arrangement that could be continued. It's just that the UK and the EU will have to negotiate that. The biggest factor is going to be essentially the UK government keeping the format of these cards the same as they are in the EU. There are some slight concerns around the fact that these are highly, highly devolved in the EU, so it's essentially often up to local authorities to accept them. Brexit has caused a lot of confusion, so I don't think we can guarantee that there might not be some authorities that don't know that these should still be accepted, and so I think people travelling will want to be on guard a little bit there, particularly because the UK government was very quick to change the format of them before Brexit even took place at the UK level. European health insurance cards are a little bit more of a concern. This is a European Union mechanism by which you can travel to another European member state and still benefit from all the health insurance that you have in the UK. You can receive treatment in the EU, and you shouldn't be treated any differently than the nationals of that member state. The costs should eventually come back to the NHS. This has been particularly helpful for people who require dialysis, for instance, who go abroad and need treatment while there. Now, the concern here is that in the run-up to what would have potentially been a no-deal Brexit, UK government issued guidance saying that people travelling to the EU should procure private travel insurance. Now, this is a fairly safe recommendation for them, but obviously for disabled people this can prove to be very, very expensive, particularly if you have pre-existing conditions. This is the concern. European health insurance cards covered pre-existing conditions without any concerns. Not all private travel insurance does, and where it does, it's an expensive feature. So this may well create barriers for disabled people when travelling abroad. So, moving on to what I think will be the biggest challenges of the next phase, it's clearly the timeline. There isn't enough time to negotiate all of these things that we'd like to see in this agreement, and I think that leads to sort of several different risks. Perhaps the most obvious is that we may have a less ambitious trade agreement with the EU than we'd like. So maybe by the end of this year, we won't know whether we're continuing participation in Erasmus. We might not know whether we're continuing participation in Horizon Research, for instance. And certainly the UK government's negotiating mandate isn't really all that ambitious anyway. Scenario B that I've listed here might be that we leave without a trade agreement. The UK government at the moment is quite vocal in saying that if this doesn't work out, we will walk away from the trade negotiations. It's difficult to tell whether that's political standing at the moment or whether or not it actually is serious, but we could see an extension to the transition period as well. The UK government have tried to legislate against it, but the withdrawal agreement does provide for the potential to extend, up to one extension of up to an extra 2 years. I think certainly from a civil society perspective, we'd very much like to see the process extended so that a proper relationship can be negotiated. But again, I'm not too sure in terms of the UK government's stance on this being favourable. And it might be that we'll get a fairly basic free trade agreement with the EU by the end of the year, but then see smaller deals need to be negotiated after that on things like the European Health Insurance Card, continuation of pension portability, and things like that. Which is why I think we need to be worried that it might be that the details that particularly this group need from Brexit might take a while to emerge. Now, all of these scenarios raise concerns because it's going to make providing scrutiny and having a voice in negotiating this process very difficult for organisations like Disability Wales. The timeline is so tight that it gives us very little time to feed into this process. I suppose there is a silver lining in that. I just read coming over that the UK government's negotiating position does include a consultation around this spring. It's around the economic impact of their suggestions, but that's not to say there might not be scope for organisations like Disability Wales and other rights-based organisations to input into it. Despite that, I think overall UK government is not keen to listen to civil society on this, so that means that we're going to need to be vocal and creative. And my concern is that much like in the previous phase of Brexit, the rights dimension will be missed. The EU has been quite firm, I think, in raising this issue, and when we spoke to organisations in Brussels about it recently, they were quite keen for us to tap into them to try and push the rights dimension of Brexit so that no one loses out. But we're not seeing that willingness on the part of UK government. I think we're quite lucky that Welsh government are very keen to this. As Rian mentioned, they've commissioned research in this area, and they work quite closely with us on these issues. So I think we're quite lucky at the devolved level in that regard. To conclude, and to make a few recommendations, I think that the trajectory for change is worrying, and so we need to be very vigilant. It's very easy, I think, to take past progress for granted. This sector in particular has had to fight for its rights for a very long time, and just because we've acquired them doesn't mean they can't roll back, or doesn't mean that the momentum can't be lost. So I think we need to be vigilant on that front. We'll need to be proactive, coordinated, and creative in pushing these issues to UK government and other stakeholders. I think when we spoke to organisations in Brussels, they were quite keen to see a devolved voice emerge, so partnerships between Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, pushing joint messaging out around keeping human rights and disabled people's rights active. I think we might want to consider joint actions with organisations like the trade unions, who are also very vocal in this area, as well as using our connections at the European level. We absolutely want to keep the rights and programmes that we've gained from EU membership, and I think we should be pushing for impact assessments as well, particularly around the trade agreements that we're going to negotiate, not just with the EU, but also with a variety of third-party countries. And finally, I like to end on this point. The political declaration that the UK government signed, which is supposed to provide a framework for negotiating this agreement, in Article 125 essentially enshrines a role for civil society to have a voice in this process. The UK government agreed to it. I'm absolutely certain it didn't come at the impetus of UK government. This is something that the EU tends to require in many of its agreements. Civil society participation is quite ingrained at the European level, so they like to see this in there automatically. But nevertheless, the UK government agreed to it, so we should be pushing them and asking how they are planning on implementing it. So, that's pretty much all I had to say at this point. I'm conscious that was quite a lot of information in a very short span of time. So, we've got a project website. It's relatively new, and we're still in the process of populating it, but do go and have a look at that. And our project is here to answer questions and work with organisations and people around Brexit. So if you have any questions or would like to explore any issues, we can provide bespoke answers, bespoke briefings, and organise partnership events as we have done with Disability Wales around Brexit. So do feel free to get in touch on my email address or through Rian and Disability Wales more generally. So I'll probably try and end on a positive, as I usually do. You know, I highlighted a lot of concerns, but Brexit is an opportunity for change, nevertheless. I don't think we can take it for granted that the change will be positive if we don't push it. But I think, you know, in the past, this sector has made very, very good advances in this area, and this is an opportunity to do so again. So, you know, I think with effort, we don't have to be too sad, although I am. Thanks very much.